My name is Dennis Sullivan. I'm the historian of the village of Voorheesville since 1986. And also, which I forgot about, but just recalled a little while ago, speaking to some folks at this event, that I was the first chairperson of the Historic Preservation Commission of the town of New Scotland. At a time when the town was very concerned about preserving its history, preserving its natural resources. We see right now there are issues about that with big box and things of that sort. I came to Voorheesville because I was interested in the rural, semi-rural quality of this village. Uh, that quality has held true, has stayed that way since the 19th century. And that is one of the reasons that many people have come to Voorheesville to be a part of that. The history of Voorheesville was always came with a sense of community, where people gathered together in many, many different kinds of ways. They came here for picnics on the railroad. They came for honeymoons on the railroad. Just down the street where the Grove Hotel stood, it was known as the Honeymoon Hotel because newlyweds would jump on the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad, take a short visit out, and stay at Conrad Fryer's Hotel. So people came here because Voorheesville seemed to have, and in fact did have, a sense of community that people gravitated to. That's why I came here originally. That's why my wife came here originally. We wanted to share in that community that was continuous over time. If you go to a town like Guilderland, or if you go to a town like Bethlehem, those towns grew out of suburban sprawl, so to speak. There were roads coming out of the city of Albany, and the town of Guilderland grew up that way, as the same with Bethlehem. Voorheesville and Altamont are unique because we grew up as stops on the railroad. So there is nothing, when you leave Voorheesville to go to Altamont, it's a rural area. When you leave Voorheesville to go to Guilderland Center, it's a rural area. The same when you go to the city of Albany, the same when you go to Bethlehem. There are still rural places because we were just a little stop on the railroad, and we don't share many of the qualities that these more suburban sprawl-like communities have.
You didn't mention that you are an author of historical books. And I think that's actually very important because this is an awesome book of reference for almost everybody, and a lot of these snippets that are in here can never be gotten again.
They can't.
You know.
Oh.
Right?
Yes. Ready? What many people don't know about the historians that are part of every municipal government in the state of New York is that I believe it was 1917, New York State passed a law that every municipality, county, town, and village was to appoint a historian. And the purpose of that job was, that person's job was to go and to do a history of that municipality, whether it was a village, an incorporated village, a town, or county, or even the state. And I'll talk a little bit in a minute about one of our famous New Scotland people, state historian Arthur Pound. As part of that job in 1986, I began to investigate the Bender Melon Farm down at the junction of routes 85 and 85A in the town. I did a small monograph on that. It was one of the most famous cantaloupes in the history of agriculture, not only in New York State, but in the United States. The Harris Seed Company from Rochester bought those seeds from Charles Bender every year, and finally bought the seeds totally. So we have that sort of agricultural aspect of the town as well. But as a historian, I became interested in that and wrote a monograph. I also wrote a history book on this village, a 180-page history book, Voorheesville, New York, a sketch of the beginnings of a 19th century railroad town. And that book, which is written, is very accessible, was written for people in the village, tells the story of this town and how the railroad transformed this town. And I say the railroad, which is not exactly correct because this was a junction town. We had two railroads coming through, and we could take a walk just a short way from the library here and show where that junction existed. So this village became an extraordinary source of not only for farmers growing materials, but for those materials, those products, apples, pears, fruits, hay, those items to be sent to different parts of the county. Even bluestone was brought down from the Helderbergs by the Cummings brothers by wagon. And most of the sidewalks in Altamont and Voorheesville and other places in the county were built from that bluestone that the Cummings brothers brought here. But anyway, the point being that as historian, my job was to put together a history of the village, which the village board at that time decided that they wanted to publish as a village publication. And thanks to Ed Clark, who was the mayor then, and Susan Rockmore and Dan Ray, who were trustees, or they were three of the most influential, excited people about that project. And that book still is available for $4 million a copy. Thank you. One of the things that I found interesting about this history in looking at where Voorheesville is situated in Albany County, where the town of New Scotland is situated in Albany County. I began to look at the maps. I began to study the available maps. The 1851 Sydney map, the 1854 Gould map, by a map put together by Robber Baron, the great Robber Baron. When he died, was considered the richest man in these United States. Jay Gould grew up as Jason Gould, later changed his name to Jay Gould. So I began to look at those maps. I looked at an earlier map, a 1789 map, which is called the Von Baal map. It was a patent that Jan Hendrickson von Baal, who was a magistrate of the court in Albany at that time, bought this piece of property right out from under the noses of the Van Rensselaers. And ironically, he was a friend of the Van Rensselaers. And they would share stories about their histories going back and forth to the Netherlands. But it became a great source of consternation for the Van Rensselaers. And for a period of about 90 years, it was a source of legal proceedings. And that patent was essentially a land that was in a square that started about Russell Road in Albany, ran out to Prospect Hill Cemetery, down to New Salem, and back to Russell Road. So the suit was over that very piece of prime property here. Anyway, speaking about the maps, one of the great map makers of all time in the state of New York was the robber baron Jay Gould, who actually walked these very streets. If you walk outside the library right here now, we walk along Depot Road and we walk out to the Altamont Road. Jay Gould, with his odometer, walked those roads and made his map of Albany County in 1853, 1854. The map was produced in 1854. And ironically, those maps are very, very scarce. I tried to buy an original copy of that map for many, many years. It had great difficulty. The State Library has a copy now, and the Institute of History and Art has a copy as well. I tried to buy that map. It is, of all county maps, it is a very, very scarce map. What I found out in reading a poem of Arthur Pound, who was a state historian for several years. Arthur Pound and his family live up at the corner of Bullock Road and New Scotland Road. Arthur Pound has a poem in his book called Mountain Morning, which I have here, Mountain Morning and Other Poems by Arthur Pound. It's a beautiful book. It's a limited edition, a signed copy, signed number 365 of 500 copies. I've had several of these. I gave the other ones away to friends.
Dennis, let me interrupt you.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I've made a cookie.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I'm rolling again. Sorry to interrupt.
In one of those maps that I was talking about earlier was produced by Jay Gould, the famous robber baron, who actually owned the Erie Railroad, and the railroad Albany-Susquehanna that ran from Albany past our very doors here to Erie. Jay Gould bought that railroad because he wanted that to connect with the coal mines down in Binghamton. Jay Gould produced his own map in 1853, and it was published in 1854. It says under that map drawn by Jay Gould. Now, I tried to buy a copy of that map for years. They're very, very scarce. I found out in reading a book of poetry that Arthur Pound, the state historian, produced many, many years, a limited edition. It's called Mountain Morning. It's this beautiful book right here. In this book, Arthur says, who had a copy of the map himself hanging on his wall at his home, Arthur tells us why that map was scarce. Because Jay Gould was very embarrassed when he became a robber baron about work that he thought was menial. This is what Arthur says in his poem called Jay Gould, Cartographer. And I'll just read a couple of lines here. The strangest thing about this map of Jay's is that he tried to buy all copies in and burn them. After he had grown rich on gold and railroads, these neat examples of his early toil disturbed his vanity. In affluent later years, Jay craved to be remembered as a financier in Wall Street, not as a poor boy doing honest work for people. Yet I wouldn't be surprised, the way the railroads dwindle year by year, to see this map of his outlive the Erie. So that is the reason why these maps are so scarce. Jay ordered his folks to buy them and to have them burned up to the extent that was possible. That's on that one. What else? What else we?
I'm going to pause for a second.
Yeah.
It's there. And you could find out. You could go to Antiques. You could go. You could call and say, "Yeah, take that."
That's very generous.
All right,
Really?
You're so funny.
One thing at a
You'd
time.
rather bring
Yes,
more
I got it.
Because
products.
we're gonna end up making these things into
Little
bit ones. So if you segue right into something and
All right,
start to say, all right,
okay.
and I'm going to start talking about this next thing. So
Gotcha.
I'm going to mention at the end of this.
All right. All right.
Unless it just kills the flow, and, but I'm just saying.
I have it.
But I'm rolling, Melissa.
Okay.
Voorheesville, as many people who live here today know, has a very, very strong sense of community. That just did not grow out of thin air. There has been sort of a genealogical continuity between the 19th century Voorheesville and Voorheesville today. For example, at one time during the 19th century, there were bees, not bees that float around in the air collecting pollen, but in a way they were. They were people bees, where people from the village and the surrounding area in the town of New Scotland would come together to help each other in the way the Amish would. There were bond bees. There were quilting bees, where people would come together and help somebody put their bond together the way the Amish would raise a bond. If we go down along Route 85 towards the village of New Scotland, we see that very large bond that was on the Levy's farm, is still there. That was put together by folks engaged in a bee. So the sense of collectivity and community in the village, where people would have conversations about what's taking place in their daily lives, about what's about to happen. They would talk about those things while they were putting together a quilt, or while they were having a social bee for ice cream, or while they were putting together a barn. So the bees became a very, very important part of the villages and the town of New Scotland's community continuity at that time. Also, when we look at the when we look at
Hang on a second. Don't even bother with
All right.
also.
when we look at the history of the commerce of this village, as we all know who live in this town and village, the railroad was central. And the railroad made possible commerce that was not possible before that. There happened to be two stone merchants, two brothers who were stone merchants in the village, the Cummings brothers, who brought Helderberg bluestone from Burn area down by Wagon. And it was such a dangerous pursuit that they had to tie a huge piece of stone around the back of the wheels so that the wheels wouldn't turn, so that essentially the horses wouldn't get run over by the stone. That was one thing. Also, farmers began to produce many more apples in the area because apples could be shipped out. But also it brought in companies such as the cider mill, which Voorheesville had. So the railroad made possible all these acts of commerce, all these acts of agriculture, which made Voorheesville this little Voorheesville, this shipping area for a section of Albany County. There are people in the village who are pieces of history themselves, artifacts of sorts. I've known some of these people for many years. One of the people that I found most fascinating was Philip Pettinger, who lived right down the street from the library here for many, many years. He worked in the railroad. He was a telegrapher inside the railroad. He ran the telegraph. And Phil would sit in Ricky's store every single day while that store was still open, every single day, and play cards and talk about the days when he used to be a part of the railroad here in Voorheesville. There are other people as well who have been in Voorheesville for many, many years who are artifacts of sorts themselves. Donald Beecham, who for many, many years was the village attorney for the village board in Voorheesville, and was also an attorney having a business here in our little village. Don has many, many stories about the social life of the village, which many, many people have forgotten. I believe he's lived here for 60, maybe 70 years. So Donald Beecham, at some point, might be someone that people in this village would like to invite over to their house to sit by their fireside and tell stories about the history of Voorheesville.
Awesome.
That's a nice way of.
Can we do one more for Mike Reiki?
Yeah.
And his tour. And I like the point about they never had to leave the village to go get their daily merchandise because we had it all here.
Right.
And
Right.
that's how the businesses ended up thriving too.
True.
We didn't leave our town to go
All right.
elsewhere.
Okay, that's. I'll talk about that, and then I'll introduce Mike Rickey, but separately about that. All right. Okay, go. One of the interesting things about getting groceries and foodstuffs these days is we jump in our car. Most of us do anyway, and we go to a large supermarket. What many people, particularly younger people, have no sense of at all is that Voorheesville at one point had 4 grocery stores right on Main Street. 4. It's hard to believe that a village of 500 people would have 4 grocery stores. No one left the village. They left the village by trade to go to school and to go into the city to do business, but no one left the village for the most part to get their groceries. There was a department store right on Main Street, so people could get their notions at the department store. They could buy thread, they could buy blankets, they could buy hats. We had a hat maker in the village for years. We had a cigar maker, Hallenbach Cigar Company. We had a business that made collars and buttons for manufacturers of shirts in Troy. So even people going to work did not have to get into their car when automobiles were available in the early part of the 20th century. People just walked downtown, talked, and sometimes would take a half hour or an hour to go for a simple can of milk. I know myself, years ago, when I knew many, many of the older people in the village, people, so to speak, left over from the 19th century, it would take me some days an hour to go from my house to the post office because I would run into so many people and converse with them all the time. Now, when we speak of grocery stores in the village, there was one store that the Swift family owned, which was a grocery store, and later became the store of the Rickey family, who owned that store for probably 40 years. That was that store ran continuously for 100 years as a grocery store. So from all the stores in the village of Voorheesville, it was the store that ran continuously, unchanged, for 100 years. I happened to write the last article, I happened to write an article for the Altamont Enterprise about the closing of that store in 1986. It was the December issue of the Altamont Enterprise, where I interviewed Mike Rickey. A picture of that day, a blown up picture of that day, is now in Hannaford, our former Super Value Nichols grocery store. There's a very large blown up picture of that last day of Mike Rickey's store.
Excellent.
That's it. All right, so I hope you got some stuff,
No, that's great. And actually, one of the names, working names of the video I'm coming up with was, I didn't want it to be quaint. You know what I mean? But quaintness is so right on the money, but I don't want it to be, down. But I do have one of my working titles to bump off with you would be Voorheesville, small town built on community.
Wow.
But I thought that got the buildings in and the community spirit, and that was one of them.
Nice.
The other one was built on spirit, but I like community better because spirit,
Yeah.
too much dead.
I'm
And
ready.
a conversation with a small town.
I'm sure, you know what? I bet you could ask a writer for a title.
I know. I am. I'm
Okay.
saying yes to
I'm ready. So we're.
All right, are we ready?
No, I filled up my check.
All right, last story.
All right.
Are we rocking?
I'm rolling.
All right. As historian, I got many, many requests to help people with genealogy over the years, and I helped them to the extent I could. At the present moment, I could tell you, with respect to 40 houses in this village, who laid the foundation for the house, who framed the house, who painted the house. Because at one point, I had gone and read every single issue of the Altamont Enterprise from its beginning in 1886 to the middle of World War II. And as I received those requests for people, from some woman in Boston, I received a request. Did I know, I won't even mention the person's name, did I know anything about a flagman who had worked on the railroad? Because what she had found out was that that flagman was her father, and that he had left his mother, her mother, and the family, and had come to Voorheesville and remarried. And that he had died here in Voorheesville, and that she wanted to find out some information about her father, whom she had only known as a child. So I was able to find out, and I did have information available about that person, where he lived here in the village, and how and when he died. So that was a story, that is one of the more fulfilling stories that one of the most fulfilling tasks that I did as the village historian with a genealogy, when people are trying to find out more than just dates about their family, but trying to find out in what ways their heart is connected to other villages. That's
Great.
best I could do.
That's
Oh, that's
fantastic.
That's
All right, I'm gonna
that
say-
is a true.
Well, where'd you go to school to?
I'm ready.
Oh.
Give it
Oh,
to
okay.
Dennis. Let Dennis have
Okay.
Could you, Mr. Beecham, tell us who you are and how you came to Voorheesville
Okay.
and what kind of work that you do.
Okay. My name is Don Meacham. Our family moved here in 1940 from northern New York. My dad was the manager of Indian Ladder Farms, which was the premier apple, at that time, dairy farm in the area. I attended Voorheesville School, graduated from there, went to college, went to law school, and set up a small law practice here in the village. What
Now,
more can I say?
All right, we have other questions. Now you were into the service
Mhm.
and you moved back to Voorheesville. Obviously, there were many opportunities for you to move elsewhere. What brought you back to Voorheesville to live and settle?
Yeah, well, I after the service, I lived for 2 years in Sodus, which is in central New York on a agricultural region. And then that's when I decided to go to law school. And I went in Albany, and when I finished there, I just gravitated back to Voorheesville without looking at many other options.
And what brought you back?
Dennis, hang on one second. Okay, sorry.
Could you talk a little bit about the farm, the apple farm that your father worked on? What kinds of things he did there, what that farm did for Albany County, and what you did as a kid there?
Oh, sure. Well, my dad, when we moved down here, became the manager. At that time, there was a dairy herd. They had chickens, they had apples and pears. That was the crops. And they had a milk route, they had their own bottling plant. And my dad oversaw everything outside of the dairy barn. They had a separate herdsman, whose son, incidentally, was my best friend. And so we took care of everything on the outside of the dairy farm. We put the hay in, we picked the apples, took care of the crops. And that was my father's job, was to manage that whole outside business. And as soon as we were old enough or strong enough, we would assist in the farm chores after school, weekends, and we loved every minute of it. I had 2 younger brothers who came along and did about the same thing that I did. If you visit the farm now, you'll notice that they bring their apples in on 20 bushel bins. When we moved here, and for years thereafter, everything was handled in 1 bushel crates. So every apple that was picked went in a crate, got loaded onto a wagon, either pulled by tractor or a truck, put into the barn or the storage. We had cold storage then taken out, and most of there was no retail then. It was mostly wholesale business. A lot of stuff we took up to Ballston Spa to store there, and also into Central Warehouse in Albany. Well, there's an awful lot of hand labor. I can recall during the World War II, we would get these fellows that didn't want to go into the service, so they were draft dodgers. They were exempt because they would get a job on a farm, so they would come out there and and they were good workers. They were all young guys, eligible for the draft. But we put corn in. They had what they call a corn binder, which would tie up several stalks of corn, dump it on the ground. These guys would load it on the wagon, take the wagon to the barn, up to the silo, unload it by hand into what they call an Enschlicht chopper, which would chop it up in small pieces and flume it up to the top of the silo. So in that respect, my job was either cutting the string on the bundles of corn before it went in the chopper, or being in the silo because you had to stomp it down. You compacted the green silage as it came in. We had 2 teams of horses then, and 2 tractors, both of which were on iron. They were Cletrax, which is a division of whatever, Caterpillar maybe, and 2 teams of horses. And one of my last memories with the horses is I was allowed to drive the team from the cornfield to the silo. And it didn't take any skill because the horses knew where they were going, and so you just hold the reins and they'd take the rest into their own hands and feet, I guess feet.
Can I interrupt here? We didn't hear what your father's name was, and how long did he work for?
Okay.
Indian Ladder? There was another question I had there. If you worked on farms, what made you go to law school? What was your spark?
Okay, now that you've asked that,
Yep.
Dennis, would you ask those questions?
And
for
yeah,
us?
and your focus is on.
Okay. Well, I like to look at pretty girls too, you know.
So Dad, state your father's name, how long
Sure.
he lived on how long he worked on the farm,
Okay.
and did he retire or die there?
Yeah.
or-
Okay.
Sorry.
Well,
If-
my dad's name was Robert, but nobody ever called him that. He was always Bob. And we were there at Indian Ladder Farms from 1940 to 1956. I was in the service when he moved to Sodus, New York. And what was the other question?
Well, we can get that. Well, how did living on the farm influence your social life? What was social life
Oh.
like in the afternoons, the evenings, weekends? What
Well, basically, we didn't have much of a social life growing up because our time was spent on the farm. If you were old enough to go out and socialize, probably you were old enough to work, and that's pretty much what we did. And the transportation was the other problem. In those days, not everybody had a car. There was one per family if you were lucky. And then, of course, there was a war with the gas rationing, and that curtailed the travel some. But the traction bus, which is now CDPC or whatever it is, then it was Albany Traction, and they used to send a bus out past the farm to Gardner Road. It would turn around at Gardner and then go back to what they call the plaza down in Albany. And for 20 cents each way, we could take the bus, take the traction bus. If you had $1.50 in your pocket, you could go to Albany, hit a movie, get a hot dog at Duke's and a soda, and get back home, and usually have a dime or so left. So that was basically our entertainment. Later on, well, the older guys a few years older than me had plenty of places to go in the village. There was a bunch of taverns. One was the Harris House, which was also the headquarters for the Republican Party. Those days you could put all the Democrats in the town in a phone booth. and you could put all the Roman Catholics in a little bit larger phone booth. It was a WASP community. That's changed. But if you got tired of the Harris House, you had Smitty's, you had the Woodlawn Tavern, which is where the Hannaford is now out front, or you could go down to the Grove Hotel, and Frank Jabanowski and Paul Harco would be down there calling square dances. I think that was maybe it for the village, unless you went down to the Rod and Gun Club, which was easy to get into. And then they had the Legion. So it's quite a few watering holes. And but we didn't seem to have the problem of drunken drivers or rowdy behavior. Once in a while a guy'd get a snootful. But the policeman, there would be one in the area, it'd be a state policeman who usually lived in town, would calm things down, get the guy a ride home, and pick up the car the next day. So it was a little easier then, but there's a little less traffic on the road too. And if you wanted to go out of the village, you would head toward New Salem, and at the foot of the road there was Happy's Bar. You go up the hill and there was the Indian Ladder Lodge, and you go the other way and there was the Helderberg Lodge, and you go to the end of the road up by the letter S, there was the Little Lodge or something they called it. That was so nobody got thirsty if they liked beer.
Now, you've also talked about in the past that you thought there were more characters in the village of those days than there are today. Could you maybe describe one or two of the characters?
Well, yeah, there was. Well, I got to know these guys. One summer, I got to know up ahead Steve. His name was Steve Skrovenak or something like that. He couldn't speak that much English, but he was always happy, and he lived down there in a building next to the Woodlawn Tavern, and he would like to visit the Woodlawn, and he got around on his bike, and one time he had a motorbike. I remember, I think they may have taken that away from him one Sunday after church. Well, Steve didn't go to church, and I don't know where he got his package on, but he had dumped his bike in the ditch across from the grade school, so I didn't see him riding that much anymore. Then they had a guy called Blind Joe, who lived with Wanda Krause, who ran a rooming house next to the Legion Hall. And you'd see Joe, he'd always vote, and Wanda would help him vote, go in the booth with him. So he probably, I don't know if he knew how he voted, but Wanda did. And another guy we had who lived down next to the Grove Hotel was Big Nose Al, they called him. And Ovilla Knoll was his name, and he was an orphan. He used to tell me about that. He was an orphan, and he was born in Rhode Island, and I got him a birth certificate, and he was forever grateful for that. But Al used to he wore this big long black overcoat most of the time, and inside there were pockets on either side, and he had any important paper that he wanted to carry in those pockets. So those are probably the three memorable characters I can think of right off the bat, but I'm sure there are several others.
Now there was no television earlier, and I don't see any movie theaters in Voorheesville. Were movies ever available for people to see?
Yeah,
if there were, where would you go see a movie?
Once a week, the Legion would put on a movie, and where the kitchen is now was an elevated stage, and the projection room was upstairs to the rear, and so I forget what it cost. They had the folding seats. They'd take them all out and line them up, and that's where you went to the movies unless you could get into Albany or Delmar. Delmar had a movie theater they called the Dump. But that was it for movies. We didn't have a television set until probably 1953 or so. The first TV I ever saw was down on Augie Berger's lawn, down on Voorheesville Avenue, and I remember seeing the Lewis Kahn fight, whatever year that may have been. And Augie had invited some people down, and he had this big console TV, probably it was like 5 feet long, and it had a screen about 8 inches. So you were watching these little figures dance around on the screen, but that was it was a first for us.
And who was August Berger?
Augie Berger was he was a village stalwart. He was I think he's on the Board of Education. I'm not sure if he was a village trustee. He was very active in the church and in the ambulance service. He was I believe, one of the founders of the ambulance service. And he worked for Albany Med. I don't know exactly what he did, but something in the electronics line.
Dad, could you talk a little bit about the grocery stores that were in Voorheesville?
Oh.
Still, when you were younger living here.
Oh yeah.
What were some of the names of the stores, and what were they like?
Well, we had it was Torx. Let's see. I don't even know what they called it. Next to my office on everything was on South Main then. So at probably 22 South Main was a grocery store run by Jasper Tork, and then later on by Gus Brate. I'm not sure, there was somebody in between. And then down at the end of the street was Ricky's store. And they stocked just about anything you'd want to buy in the grocery line. I remember during the war, they would, I think the Gus Brate's store would deliver your groceries. You could call an order in, and they would deliver it because people didn't have any gas to get there. So I don't know where they got theirs, maybe special dispensation, and maybe they got extra coupons, rationing coupons, but they would deliver groceries.
And what about businesses like the foundry and the cider mill?
Oh yeah, they were going great guns. The cider mill employed numerous, mostly local people, and there's an awful lot of folks. You talk to the older folks around here who had worked at the cider mill. We used to take a lot of, and it was a good outlet for the orchards around here, because there were a lot more orchards than Indian Ladder Farms. There was one at Picards. Both sides of the road were apple trees, and then many small farmers around who, like Allen Hurst, where Pheasant Run Apartments are. That was all orchard, and probably a half a dozen others. And that was an outlet for their apples. If they didn't sell them retail, you can always take them down to the cider mill, and we took thousands of bushels there probably. And the foundry there employed a lot of local folks, but an awful lot of folks came out from the city. They'd come out on the bus and work there, and when they would leave at night, they would be, if they weren't already, they would be black. I mean, that's the foundry soot got in their clothes, in their skin, in their hair. So it took a while to clean up if you were a foundry guy, but
Tell us what a foundry is.
Okay.
Like in the end, you know what I mean? Because I have to think it through as you're talking about it. So the foundry was great
I
because
have a good picture of it for everyone. I have one other question, social life, when you speak to the foundry. Did you ever go swimming in the dammed up Bly Creek where they had that pool?
yeah.
I knew you did. Would you touch on that with Marlene? Marlene Prentice is going to be here later, and she grew up on there, the Kling farm, Olive Kling, and
Well,
That
maybe
was a-
she did. I'm not sure.
Was it called Van Dusen, is that now?
That was Wendell Specs.
William Spexon?
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Wendell Speck owned the place on 85A, where that was. It was not only a swimming hole. They dammed up the Fly Creek, and the two Wendell Speck girls were the kind of lifesavers. Vera, who was a little bit younger than Olive, and Vera taught me to swim. That's where I learned to swim. It cost a dime. You'd ride your bike there and pay them the dime, and swim as long as you wanted. Then in back, they had a pavilion. They had picnic grounds. The churches would go there and have their picnic if they didn't go up to White Sulphur Springs and burn. But I guess there's still remnants of some of those picnic spots across the creek. You had to go across the creek.
And one other social thing that I saw in your book, but I don't know anyone else who's mentioned this, is that Indian Ladder had a diner over on 85, and I believe it's where the ice cream parlor area is now, and it had a drive-in movie behind it.
Drive-in movie theater?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know when that was, but if
Well,
it was here during that time.
Okay.
Maybe talk about the drive-in movie theater that was over on 85.
Yeah. Yeah. It that was a family affair too. A fellow by the name of Hollenbeck, I think, owned that. He was had a camera shop in Albany, and they ran movies. The big thing was to pack as many kids as you could in the trunk and the car, so 2 would drive in and pay, and 8 or 10 would watch the show, or you'd walk in the exit and join your friends in there. And across from that, Chet Neal had this. It was Neal's. It was mainly his specialty was fried clams. So yeah, and you could sit up there and watch the drive-in. You couldn't hear anything, but you could see the whole screen. And Chet started that up after the war. I think he had his initial place was at the end of Happy's Tavern over in New Salem, and then he built the place up there. And incidentally, years later, his son owned and operated the Voorheesville Diner, John Neal.
Now, go back to the foundry for a second. Would you talk about the smells? I'm sorry. Talk about the smells of the cider mill and the sounds, the whistle, going off. What do you remember in terms of smells and the railroad cars being down at the foundry? I'm sorry, at the cider mill.
Well, I know they had their own siding. I don't really remember that much about it. The smell mainly was the rotting apples. I forget what the pumice, I guess they call it, after they'd pressed out the cider. I think they'd dump it down there somewhere, but that would work up. You'd smell that, and the sounds I mostly associate with the village would be the train. We would hear the train. It was a steam engine then, so you'd hear the train up on the farm. Given if the wind was right, you'd really hear it in the summer when the windows were open. It was a wonderful sound and a very nostalgic thing to hear recordings of it now, because it does take me back to the operation of the train. Incidentally, the farm used to get what they called shooks, which was material for building these bushel crates. And we would come down to the siding, which is across from the old Harris house. There was an active siding there, and with a truck, and they'd get a carload full of these shooks and take them back, and we would have this machine or that we'd build the bushel boxes out of, just thousands of them. The other thing we did from the farm was they got what they called beet pulp, which they fed to the cows. It was the leftover from pressing beets for sugar, and they'd get that in these huge bales, and apparently cows liked it.
What about the passenger train? Did you and/or anybody in your family take the passenger train into the city?
You know, I never did. I heard a lot of people did. We would, our experience with the passenger trains would be when we were skating down on Weidman's Pond. That's when we'd see them. Weidman's Pond was off of Coons Road down next to the D&H tracks. And we'd be down there at night, and group of people skating, and you'd have your bonfire going, and you got more ice then in the winter, and that was really sounds corny, but it was a favorite sport. And there would be a dozen people down there, and you'd see the passenger train go by lit up, and people wave at you. And of course, one thing we would do is dip cattails in kerosene and then start them on fire. So that was I think it was interesting for the people on the trains to see, but it was always a treat to see it go by at night.
And a handsome guy like yourself, when you were younger in school, how did you, busy on the farm, and other people have time for girlfriends, or how did the girls have time for boyfriends?
Well, you know, any social activity came out of the school, basically, unless you took a gal to the movies at the Legion. But nobody had cars, you know. I mean, if you had an older friend that could borrow the car, or was lucky enough to have a car of his own, then you'd hitch a ride. But a lot of bicycle stuff. They had not when I was around here, but later they started what they called a canteen in the cellar of the Presbyterian Church, the old library. And that was a good social spot, and that went over very well. I believe that was like 1954, sometime in there. And that went for a few years. That was it. Wasn't a lot of social activity.
Let me ask you one more question. The final question is, since the town and village were much smaller then, did you feel that when you were out amidst your friends that you were that people were much more aware of you, that you had to be more careful, that everybody knew what was going on?
Oh, yeah.
Did you have a sense of that? Maybe talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, well, you had, yeah.
Is that true?
I would say that would be true because, well, mainly it was the church ladies. You know, if something got out of hand, your mother would hear about it, or your parents would hear about it. But there didn't seem to be any malicious destruction. I mean, there was a lot of fun, Halloween time fun. Guys put Mr. Jabonowski's wagon up on top of the school, but they didn't destroy it, and it got down okay. But yeah, everybody knew everybody. That's for darn sure. And I think the village was probably bigger than the town then. I don't know, but they're pretty much equal in size. But certainly the village was the center of the town, of the most commerce in the town.
Without a footnote question, that was ever any Christmas light shows in the village, like the board merchants would have? Do you recall that?
You know, I really don't, though. I know they had a board of trade, and George Funk was one of the former mayors. He owned the feed mill. It burned 3 times. It was pretty much the spearhead of that organization. And George was a very active guy, and he loved the village. And I guess they would have a beauty contest. They had Miss Board of Trade. The village itself always had a Christmas tree right there in the intersection that they took out in front of between Stewart's and the village hall. That was always the place for the Christmas tree, and well received.
All right, last question, Dad. Is there anything that has passed and gone that you are sad about, like a sad passing of what you saw in those earlier days? When you look back with a certain wistfulness.
Yeah, I think it was a better times then. It was an awful lot of fun, even though it was difficult to get around. It was just a great place to live. I enjoyed the farm so much. We worked hard. But we had so much fun there. We didn't know we were poor. And actually, for me, the farm was kind of a social place, because my friends always liked to come up to the farm and visit. And just one little note, kind of off of that, but to show how the community went and how close it was. We had a snowstorm in May, and the leaves were on the trees naturally, and my dad was afraid that the heavy snow would go breaking the limbs. So he called Mr. Boughton, the head of the school, and asked if he could get some people to work. So they told me, said, get some guys together. So I got about a half a dozen guys off the football team or whatever it was, and all went up to the farm. My dad gave them big, long poles, and they went around banging the limbs to knock the snow off. But it was that easy. A phone call, and that did it. It was still an agricultural community.
What do you think? God Beecher, ladies and gentlemen.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
God
Okay.
Beecher.